Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in this conversation with the Honorable Michèle Flournoy. My name is Bilal Saab. I am a senior fellow at MEI, and I run the Defense and Security Program of the Institute. Today, I have the distinct privilege of moderating this important conversation on the future of defense strategy and posture in the Middle East. On June 10, not too long ago, the Defense and Security Program launched a new initiative called the Defense Leadership Series, which is a speakers forum for high-level defense and military leaders from the United States, but also from the Middle East, to discuss some of the most important policy issues facing the two sides. And we were just incredibly lucky to have General McKenzie, the Central Commander, to inaugurate that series. And we're also extremely fortunate now to have with us Michèle Flournoy in the second episode. Michèle's bio is on the MEI website, but also on the website of West Exec Advisors, which is a strategic consultancy firm that she helped co-found with a couple of colleagues of hers. Michèle has had a long and distinguished career in government, in the private sector, in the think tank community in Washington. She has served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2009 to 2012. She co-founded the Center for New American Security and served as its president until 2009 when she had to go to government. She was a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that's CSIS, for several years. And before that, she was a distinguished professor at the National Defense University, that's NDU. Michèle serves on several boards of some top companies and has received numerous awards and honors. She has a BA from Harvard and an MA from Oxford. One thing that you won't find in Michèle's official bio, but it should be there, is that many people working in this town have attended and graduated from the Flournoy School of Strategy. She has mentored many national security professionals, both inside and outside government. And she's just an inspiration to all of us, and especially to her female colleagues. Michèle, before I say another word, let me briefly turn it over to Paul, MEI's president. He is excited to welcome you to the Institute as well. Paul?
Thank you, Bilal. And indeed, Michèle Flournoy, the Honorable Michèle Flournoy, it's such a pleasure and honor to have you on this webinar. I really would have preferred that we could have welcomed you in our building, in our physical space. I know you've been there before, and I hope we can meet you there soon. So I just wanted to make sure that I added my voice to Bilal's in welcoming you, particularly as a fellow think tank sort of leader, and you founded and were president of the Center for New American Security, where a lot of our colleagues still work, and you were CEO there as well. And as sort of a co-member of the think tank community in DC, it's a special pleasure to have you. Also to salute your role in the Defense Department and perhaps future roles that the future might hold for you. So I just wanted to welcome you, myself, in the name of the board, and De Clark, who also has great respect for you. And I wanted to thank Bilal for his enormous initiative in setting this valuable conversation and the whole defense speaker series that he mentioned. So Bilal, thanks to you for all your efforts. And I will be listening very intently to your presentation, Michèle. Looking forward to it. Bilal, back to you.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, Michèle, it's just you and me. Let's start this conversation. A lot to cover, okay? And we're going to try to do most of it for the next hour or so. I think a good way to start this is with a conversation about interests, right? Our interests in the region, whether these have changed over the years, defense and security interests, I would say. And if they have, has that really led to some significant adjustments on our part, whether in terms of strategy or in posture? So let's just start with interest. How do you view those? Have they changed significantly?
Sure. Well, first, let me say thank you, Bilal, and just to the Institute. So glad to be here with you, and I'm honored to be having the conversation. And thanks for the very kind introduction. So when I think about interests, I like to go back to kind of first principles of protecting the security, prosperity, and way of life of Americans. And when you think about in those buckets, I think on the security front, we've seen that when there's instability in the Middle East, when there's lack of governance, when there's ungoverned spaces, negative things happen to the United States. So I do think in the security bucket, we have to keep a continued eye on terrorist groups that might have external ambitions against the United States and our people and our interests. We have to worry about a hostile and hegemonic Iran that could destabilize the region, try to close off the Gulf, intimidate others, affect the economic situation there and so forth. And supply weapons and support to groups that are proxies and that have interests very different than our own. So there is still a very rich security bucket. These are not necessarily problems that the United States can solve, but we need to certainly pay attention to managing them over time. And trying to reduce the risks. In the economic basket, I think our situation has changed somewhat given our own increasing energy independence. That said, so much of the world's oil and natural gas still comes from the Middle East. And so the pricing in global markets is still very much dependent on what happens to those energy flows. And so that affects us a little more indirectly, but still very important to us, as we've seen in the recent roller coaster ride of energy prices. So I think this is a region that, and oh, by the way, we still have very important allies and partners. I should mention the special relationship the United States has with Israel and our long-term, across multiple administrations, bipartisan commitment to Israel's security, and also very important partners, in the Gulf states and elsewhere in dealing with transnational challenges and common threats. So I think the interests are there. The challenge is not so much that those have disappeared, it's that the need to defend our interests in other regions, like the Pacific,
Right.
Indo-Pacific, are becoming that much more acute. So it's a question of how do you balance those trade-offs?
Right. Well, I mean, that's a perfect segue. Since you mentioned that, a lot of those security interests may not necessarily have changed. Perhaps the severity of some has risen a little bit, but certainly the economic basket, as you described yourself, has changed just for some very obvious realities and our reduced dependence on oil coming from that part of the world, even though, as you said yourself, we're not independent from it, obviously, because the price of that commodity is still affected by insecurity in the region. So does that necessitate a different kind of approach to get to the issue of strategy and posture? So starting with strategy, does that necessitate a total rethink, a reconsideration, or just a few tweaks here and there? I know that the National Defense Strategy has come up with a new concept, and you've already alluded to it yourself, with the great power competition, right? Obviously, with greater attention to different parts of the world, whether it's Europe or Indo-Pacific. What does that mean for the Middle East? Do we have to reconsider our approach to at least address the economic aspect that you described yourself?
Yeah, no, I do think that from a strategic perspective, dealing with the rise of a more assertive, if not sometimes aggressive China, a much more competitive situation with them, not only militarily, but economically, technologically, even ideologically. Also having to always keep an eye on deterring Putin and Russia, as long as Putin is in charge, and looking to make mischief whenever we become distracted. So, it's really, the hard part of that strategy is never setting what the priorities are. The hard part of that strategy is figuring out where you're going to accept and manage a degree of risk. And I think that compared to where we've been in the last 20 years, where the Middle East was the focus of our attention, the greater Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, the whole war on terror, certainly relative to where it's been, the level of attention, resources, focus is going to decline in relative terms. But it doesn't mean that we should withdraw completely, that we should ignore it, that we can forget about it. quite the contrary. We have to get much more clever and smarter about how we use all of the instruments of our power beyond just the military to try to manage the threats that persist to our interests there.
Right. So I suspect you are effectively in agreement with the top tenet pillar of the new national defense strategy, that we should be
more
focused on China and Russia.
Yes, I do. I think they're very different, but yes, I think that we need to focus more on competing with China and deterring Putin's Russia.
Okay, all right. Had a conversation not too long ago on this medium with two individuals I'm sure you've heard of, you're familiar with, Barry Posen from MIT and Steve Walt from Harvard. And I think we started a conversation about the great power competition and the whole notion of grand strategy, right? And so I asked them whether the Middle East lends itself to the very concept of grand strategy. And I got different answers. But for you, does that region, given its complexity, given how turbulent it's been, its persistent troubles, does it lend itself to grand strategy thinking, or is it, you think about grand strategy and about the world and then how the Middle East fits into that? Do we need that kind of big picture, broad thinking about the region now? Are we now apt for that kind of approach?
You know, I've been through many grand strategy exercises, and they've generally been disappointing. It doesn't mean that we don't need to think about strategy and strategically, but you know, if you're trying to sort of get to the equivalent of containment during the Cold War, or you know, what have you, I'm not sure that this increasingly multipolar world with a host of not only state originated threats, but also transnational threats, climate change, proliferation, and so forth. I'm not sure that that's the holy grail. I really do believe that this question of how do we manage our interests in multiple regions at a time, given a broad range of threats, ranging from kind of gray zone, coercive, competitive threats, all the way up to preventing actual war between nuclear powers, and do that at a time when perceptions of the US are changing. We're having an internal debate about what kind of role we should play in the world. And oh, by the way, huge technological disruption in terms of the instruments that we will use in the future to defend our interests. So I'm more interested in the focus on how do we manage risk and avoid miscalculation and avoid the breakdown of deterrence in this context. I would spend more time there right now than I would locking myself in a room trying to think about, you know, a bumper sticker that captures it all.
Right.
So I don't mean to sound astrategic. I've, you know, spent my life working on QDRs and writing defense strategies, and that is extremely important. But the notion of one grand strategy into which everything will neatly fit, not clear that that's possible right now.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be often said that, you know, the Middle East also is quite allergic to such, you know, grand strategy thinking, given its fast tempo, its many crises of the jour. Although that could, you know, lead to the argument that you precisely need that kind of thinking in order to move beyond the tactical operational issues of the day. But I hear you.
It's fair to say you need a regional strategy, you know, a way of approaching the Middle East as a region, and some common principles and guideposts for your policies and so forth. But that's different than saying we have a global grand strategy that's kind of a one size fits all for managing all of our interests across this full range of threats.
Yeah. And do you feel like we have that today as far as a regional strategy?
No, I don't.
Or when was the last time we had one?
That's hard to say. It's been a while.
Yeah.
I think part of it is there was been so much upheaval with the Arab Spring, with the Iraq War, which really fundamentally changed the dynamics in the region and the kind of mutual containment that Iraq and Iran had going. The sort of lid came off that Pandora's box with the unseating of Saddam Hussein, and we've been sort of trying to grapple with the consequences of that ever since. So I think, the last time we probably had a sort of recognizable regional strategy was before the Iraq War. I think since then, it's been one fundamental disruption after another, and we're still kind of trying to find a coherent approach that can really win bipartisan support and survive across changes of administration.
Yep. Well, with your permission, let's do a regional tour.
Okay.
Since there's no shortage of challenges that we're facing in multiple areas in the region. Let's start with arguably our biggest investment in the region, which is Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
We have crushed the caliphate of the Islamic State. That was a very successful military campaign, even though obviously the job is not complete. We have not defeated the organization because we can't do it ourselves on our own. Obviously, we certainly need the partners that you mentioned yourself to address the root causes of it. But we have effectively, like I said, destroyed the proto-state of the organization. We're trying to counter the influence of Tehran and Baghdad, but we're also trying to preserve the stability of Iraq. So talk about balances, as you said yourself. How do you balance between these two very difficult objectives, trying to preserve what we've gained in Iraq and at the same time prevent the Iranians from exercising destabilizing influence over the politics of the country?
Yeah, and this is really, it's very hard, but you've got the twin objectives absolutely right. And the problem, starting with the ISIS problem, this is the second time we've crushed this movement militarily, right? We did it with AQI, and then we withdrew. And then what that withdrawal really allowed, unfortunately, was the reassertion of a sort of approach to marginalizing the Sunni population politically, which then created this sort of fertile soil for AQI to sort of return from Syria in the form of ISIS. And then we, watched, 2.0 of the movie. We had to go through this all over again at great cost. So the question is, I think if you're going to keep Iraq out of, keep it from being fertile soil for that kind of resurgence of 3.0 on a large scale, you have to care about the politics inside Iraq. And that means, and this is where there's some alignment. I think trying to prevent Iraq from being a complete sort of satellite of Iran means trying to, prevent the Shia parties that Iran funds from being wholly dominant in Iraqi politics. That is also a step in the right direction in terms of trying to build the sort of multi-sectarian government that can function and, take care of the needs, not just of the Shia population, but also the Kurds and also the Sunnis. Because if you have a Shia-dominated government that is beholden to Iran, you're likely to have the same kind of Sunni marginalization and persecution that, gave rise to AQI and then ISIS and then whatever's going to come in the future. So I do think we have to care about, how Iraq is governed. The problem is at this point, we have far less leverage than we did when we were actually in the country militarily. But it doesn't mean we have no leverage. One of my pet peeves with this administration is just the failure to use diplomacy and political and economic leverage. We seem to always reach, or at least they seem to always reach for the coercive instruments, tariffs, sanctions, military. And part of this is the world, the hard work of diplomacy, showing up, working the problem day in, day out, using our economic support, our security cooperation support to try to push things in the right direction. And, oh, by the way, building a regional coalition that says, hey, we don't want Iraq to fall apart again. We all as neighbors, you all as neighbors have some interest in stabilizing this country.
Yeah. I'm not going to say it was the most important factor, but certainly a factor, a big factor, as to why AQI, as you yourself described, morphed into something more sinister as the Islamic State, was the withdrawal of US troops from Iraq.
Mhm.
If we were to do that again today, do you suspect that we would more likely end up in the same scenario, or are we now in a better position than we were before? We as in us and the Iraqis.
I think if we made a complete and total and rapid withdrawal, we might create some of those same conditions. The forces are there for a couple of reasons. The obvious one is to build the capacity of the Iraqi security forces to handle their own threats, internal and external. And obviously there's progress there. But the more intangible one, but still important, is a presence that sort of shapes some of the behaviors of the Iraqi leadership. And when the US completely departs the scene, that's when leaders can become very insecure and very sectarian in their perspectives and behavior. And that's very much what happened with Prime Minister Maliki after he left. He became very fearful for his survival and decided the only way he could take care of things was to go hard, anti-Sunni, very sectarian in his approach, in a way that, again, marginalized that population, kind of opened the door for ISIS to come back from Syria and so forth. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of cycle we want to avoid. I think we can do that at relatively low, with a relatively smaller, persistent presence, and coupled with this diplomatic piece, which I don't see happening. I don't see it getting the kind of diplomatic effort that it should.
Right. Let me ask a final question about Iraq, and then we'll move to the country next door, Iran. Do you worry that many Iraqis, I don't know the numbers, but a good number of Iraqis portray the United States as an occupying power? I mean, you saw that there was some agitation in the Iraqi parliament not too long ago, and there were some calls for us leaving.
Yeah.
Secretary Pompeo dismissed those calls. Now, you don't know whether there was really a consensus. Obviously, there was no consensus, I believe, about us leaving. But do you worry about these calls? And if they do come up with some kind of a consensus, I mean, we have no other choice but to pack our bags and leave, right? We don't have the permission to stay if we don't have that, approval from the Iraqi government, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this is why, being there, you have to be there in ways as you have to respect Iraqi sovereignty. We have to take that seriously. And sometimes we forget to do that with our partners. And unfortunately, literally the week before the killing of Soleimani, you had the protests in the street were against Iran and against Iranian influence in the Iraqi government. This was a surge of Iraqi nationalism, a call on the government to be not beholden to Iran and to be more effective in meeting the needs of the people. And, by targeting the general who, absolutely deserved to have a bullseye in his back, terrible, evil person responsible for many American deaths and other deaths across the region, all kinds of nefarious activities, but doing it in a way that basically no consultation with the Iraqi government, no consideration of the situation it would create for them, all that public anger, which was against Iran, and turn it on ourselves. So it wasn't, it was not thought through in the way that I would have hoped. I would have thought there'd be other ways to go after him, and without doing it in a way that basically turned the Iraqi people immediately against us and restarted calls for our departure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, we've mentioned Iran several times, so let's just address that challenge. The administration has a strategy called the Maximum Pressure Campaign, right? And we had a chance to discuss this with General McKenzie several days ago, and he asserted that there was no military or security component to the strategy. It's primarily diplomatic, led by the State Department, with a big pillar of sanctions. Do you feel like this strategy has had its fair evaluation? Is there more good than bad to the strategy? What's your own assessment of it?
You know, I am someone who believed that it was in our interest to keep the JCPOA in place, POA in place. It certainly, put time on the Iranian nuclear clock, which was in our interest, and that was a foundation on which we could build, both to expand the agreement's scope, extend its timelines, and start paying more attention to building a coalition against Iran's destabilizing activities in the region.
Yep.
But when that was torn up by the administration, they started the maximum pressure campaign to try to get a better deal. But the rest of the world really saw us as abandoning the agreement or violating the agreement, not Iran. So we've had limited leverage there. And with regard to Iran, I mean, we've sort of given them a laundry list of everything but the kitchen sink that has to change in order for them to be, the pressure to be reduced. And I just think it's not realistic. We haven't really given them an off-ramp to like how to get back to the negotiating table seriously. And so they're starting to increasingly violate the nuclear agreement to try to get other members of the international community to put pressure on us to approach them differently. So, it's certainly succeeded in creating a lot of pain inside Iranian society and pressure on the regime. But I don't think there's a clear negotiating strategy for how do you get this translating into a better agreement. And the clock is, kind of running out at least on the first term of this administration to try this. So I don't think it's been all that successful. I think we need to figure out a way to get back to a negotiated deal on the nuclear dimension, but also then start going after things like ballistic missiles, drones, and other support for terrorist organizations in the region. But I just think there's a better way to do that than trying to do it unilaterally as the United States. I mean, this is a factor that is just true across so many issues. We have a huge strategic advantage of having this network of allies and partners around the world who share many of our interests and our diagnoses of problems. We are so much more effective when we build coalitions to go after these objectives together rather than just trying to do it by ourselves.
Well, you mentioned the Gulf partners, and speaking of building coalitions, it becomes more difficult to build those coalitions when some of these partners question the security commitment that we have towards them, rightly or wrongly. Let me take you back to an incident that happened in the fall of last year, which I'm sure you've observed closely. There was an attack, an unprecedented conventional attack with 18 missiles and drones by the Iranians suspected against Saudi oil infrastructure. And we failed to deter that. And we did not respond immediately after the attack in order to at least try to prevent another one from happening. We did act against Soleimani, as you mentioned yourself, but that was not immediate. And who knows whether that was connected in terms of response. In your own assessment, I mean, what impact has that attack had on our security commitment to those Gulf partners? And do you feel like they now are so worried about it that they're starting to hedge their bets, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think the lack of response, even if you go before the drone attack, to the harassment of shipping, to the use of, to some, the shooting down of an American drone in the Gulf. These provocations kept ratcheting up. And it seemed like where we finally drew the line was when American lives were put at risk. And that's when, we finally responded. But that's a very high bar, and it's not a comforting bar for our allies and partners because they occupy several rungs before we get to that point usually. And so I think the combination of the administration's inaction in terms of trying to establish deterrence at a lower level of provocation, and the fact that we didn't rush to Saudi Arabia's aid and others' aid with offering capacity, offering counter-drone defenses and ways of protecting them. To me, that, I think made them call into question how seriously committed is the United States to their defense. How much can they rely on us?
We need some counter-drone defenses of our own, but I hear you. I wonder also if you agree with the conclusion made by some really smart people that the Carter Doctrine essentially is dead. Is that an exaggeration?
It's probably an exaggeration, but I don't. What I think that it's going to take a lot of work by a future administration to both clearly and consistently demonstrate, articulate the U.S. commitment, demonstrate that commitment, and reestablish deterrence at a more, in a more credible way. President Trump likes to talk about how being unpredictable is a good thing for deterrence. I think, I understand, the notion that occasionally you want to use ambiguous language so an enemy can't be sure of how far you will go. But it's not helpful to be unpredictable in terms of our commitment to allies and partners or their ability to count on us. And I think that's the problem. That uncertainty has been created, and that's causing hedging behavior. So a lot of these countries are now saying, well, if we can't count on the US, maybe we should get closer to China. Maybe we should get closer to Russia. Maybe we should get, maybe we should appease Iran in some way if we need to. So hedging behavior is not, when it is generally not in our interests if it's based on people questioning US leadership and commitment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's talk about the flip side of that coin and just give ourselves a break, right? In terms of the imperfection of those partners that we have in the region. Sure. During the Obama administration, there was just some tough words mentioned by the president himself. And if you recall that interview with The Atlantic with Jeffrey Goldberg about Arab free riding on US security. Yeah. And then Ash Carter himself, the Secretary of Defense, had also some pretty stern messages to the Gulf Arabs about not contributing sufficiently to certain common causes, right, and not investing in the proper tools of national defense. How frustrating was that? You must have dealt with it yourself when you were in government. How fair are those accusations, and how frustrating is it that, boy, they really are highly imperfect when it comes to these issues, and that we would love to see more contributions and them stepping up more and putting more skin in the game?
Yeah, I think it's a fair criticism, and as you say, that's been an issue or a source of frustration across multiple administrations. I think you have to distinguish between countries. I think for the UAE, for example, Secretary Mattis used to call them Little Sparta because they do tend to, they don't have a lot of capacity in terms of quantity, but they do show up, and they show up alongside us with real capability, and particularly in the Air Force and special operations. But the Saudis, for all they spend on defense and all of the equipment they buy, in terms of showing up to work alongside the United States, either militarily or with economic assistance towards a common cause, their performance has been less than desired. And then more recently, under MBS, you've had the further situation where they've been very aggressive in getting into campaigns like Yemen that the US doesn't necessarily support how they've approached that, and particularly given the civilian casualties and impact on the society as a whole. You add to that some of the internal human rights abuses, and ultimately, most notably the Saudi government's role in the killing of Khashoggi, an American journalist. There's some real issues to work through in that relationship. I'm not someone who says throw them aside. my view is that, get in there and work through some of this with them, because they are such an important player in a region where we do have important interests at stake.
Well, let's stay on the subject of Saudi Arabia, obviously the largest, perhaps most important Arab partner of ours, despite all the challenges that we have in that relationship. By any objective standard, there's a crisis in the relationship. Yeah. There's much to be excited about regarding the young leadership, but you just feel like they are learning on the job, and they're committing too many faux pas and own goals, right? I know it's not easy, but this is going to be a burden, a responsibility for the next administration, assuming that there is a new one. How do you manage that critical relationship? When we met with, when I was at the Atlantic Council, we had a visit to Riyadh, and we met with MBS, and he was astonishingly clear about, if we fail, we as in the kingdom, what you see now as far as ISIS is going to be a walk in the park. And you know what, fine, I understand that it was a tactic to scare us about how much we push on the Saudis to reform and what have you. But, we used to say that about Egypt, that Egypt is too big to fail. I never bought that, but maybe Saudi Arabia is actually one of those credible cases, because if it does fail as the custodian of the two holy mosques, we're in big trouble. So how do you manage that relationship moving forward, especially that it's so critical still to U.S. interests in that part of the world?
Yeah, no, I think we have to sit down and have a very clear-eyed and frank dialogue with the Saudis about where we share our interests, but also what our concerns are. We do have a stake in Saudi's stability. We do have a stake in the success of Saudi reforms. But we also have a stake in not having the Saudi administration be reckless in the way and sort of cross over humanitarian and sort of other lines. We can't. Our values are at stake as well, and it's not okay to murder journalists who disagree with you. It's not okay to jail women who are voicing dissent on issues. There's certain things, and we have to keep speaking those truths to our friends there. But again, I do think that a full destabilization, collapse of the Saudi regime would unleash all kinds of forces that would definitely have the potential to hurt our interests, both in the region and even here at home in terms of terrorism. So again, this is a hard one we have to manage. I guess my feeling with this administration is they've sort of given Saudi Arabia a bye. You're our best friend. We'll talk on the phone with you all the time, but we won't press you too hard, and we won't hold you accountable, and we won't, try to make you try to help you become better.
Yeah. Do you feel like we've ever had that transparent, frank conversation with the Saudis? I know that President Obama had some, like I said before, some tough words, for the Saudis and the rest of the Arab neighbors. Have we ever really had a frank conversation with them about what to do and what not to do, and how to navigate this relationship to less troubled,
I think before MBS, I think there was, particularly in the national security and intelligence channels, some pretty candid conversation about our concerns. But I think as the relationship soured at the top in the second Obama administration, probably less of that happened. But a lot of this has to be very candid, private conversations among trusted interlocutors. And I think some of those trusted interlocutors have disappeared on the Saudi side, and some have disappeared on the US side.
Yeah. You mentioned a key word earlier, which was leverage. It's nice to have it, but it's even nicer to be able to exercise it. And with regard to the Saudi relationship, and I realize that the ideal package is always a right mix of positive and negative incentives. But if you believe that we have some kind of leverage, and we do, they need our equipment. how do you most responsibly, effectively exercise it in order to induce the right kind of behavior from the Saudis?
I think actually our greatest leverage is they desperately want foreign direct investment and foreign business involvement in the kingdom. And I think one of the things that I hope they've learned in the last year or two is that when you create huge reputational risk for anybody to work with you, it's really going to undermine your own economic development and reform agenda. So the MBS succeeded in creating an environment where every American company is having a conversation, who used to be in Saudi Arabia, has had to have a conversation with their board and their investors and their shareholders as to whether they should stay. That's not a good situation. So that's the first thing. Secondly, military equipment. And here I think, frankly, the Congress has, been pretty strong and consistent on this to say, as long as you're in Yemen and conducting the kind of campaign you're conducting, we're not going to provide you with additional offensive systems. I think now, if you get into the details, peeling the onion back, I actually think the Saudis generally want out of Yemen now, as does the UAE. The Houthis are making that difficult for them and not necessarily, coming in good faith to the negotiating table. So they're having a hard time getting out, even though they actually want to get out, I believe, now. But I think using that leverage is something that you can expect the Congress to continue to do.
Got to be honest with you, I did not plan to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with you. Partly because it's such a depressing story and not a whole lot is moving forward, but something will happen on July 1st, as I'm sure you know, and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu will commence the process of annexing parts of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. I don't know how successful he will be, but it is certainly a relevant development and will have an impact on regional security in the sense that goal of Israel, which is to form closer relations with some of these Gulf partners that we've been discussing, will become much more elusive. And I'm sure you've seen the editorial by the UAE ambassador to the United States, Yusuf Al-Taiba, warning about such a move and how it will have adverse effects on that process. What's your take on that whole situation? Speaking of reckless, how reckless of a move is it by the Israeli leadership to start that process come July 1st?
I think any unilateral move that basically begins to preclude the possibility of a two-state solution, not only because it's unilateral, but more importantly, the substance of it, exactly the areas that will be annexed. It's one thing if Netanyahu said, well, I'm going to look at every map that we've ever drawn of land, of the borders and the land swaps, for every peace plan that's been, and I'm going to limit annexation only to those areas where Israel's always ended up with the land in just about any negotiation plan that you could imagine. That would be one thing. That is not what this is. This is going into the heart of a Palestinian territory and in a way that will make it very hard for there to be a viable Palestinian state in the West Bank. And that's a different story. That is trying to sort of unilaterally create a fait accompli that I think could very much backfire on Israel in a number of ways. Number one, the Palestinians aren't going to sit still. They're already going to the international community to try to get some kind of condemnation of Israel or even a declaration of a Palestinian state of their own. Two, you're going to create huge political fissures in the bipartisan support within the United States for Israel, and that bipartisan support has always been critical to Israel's security. Third, as you mentioned, if Netanyahu goes forward with this, there's no way that governments like in the UAE or in Egypt or in Jordan or in Saudi Arabia will have the political space continue building their cooperative strategic relationship with Israel as they have in the last several years. So the notion that he could do this without paying any of those prices is a fantasy. And I worry that this is where, Netanyahu he's a tactician, and he's about his political survival and feeding his base. He's not being very strategic in terms of, he's playing checkers. He's not playing chess in terms of thinking that the next move and the next move and how somebody will counter move. This is not going to be good for Israel in the end.
I want to end on the regional strategic issues before I move on the final 15 minutes to the domestic front with this concept of the great power competition. It's our new constitution in the Pentagon, and we take it very seriously. There's still a lot of work regarding a more a clearer definition of the term and operationalization of the term, right? What do we really mean by competition? But with regard to the Middle East, do you feel like we need, like we have an irregular warfare strategy, do you feel like we need a China strategy for the Middle East or a Russia strategy for the Middle East in terms of how do we manage that competition?
I think we need to look at the Middle East in its own right, but we also need to look at it through the second lens of an area of competition, both first and foremost with China, but also, as we've seen, with Russia. When we create a vacuum, as in Syria, Russia is quite happy to step in and try to exploit that. It may be regretting some of that right now, but it's having trouble figuring out its own exit strategy. But no, of course, we need to look at how will China try to take advantage of a situation in the Middle East. But I don't know that we need separate strategies quite the way you described them. But in my view, there are a couple of things vis-a-vis China that we should sort of prioritize. Number one is the most important thing we can do in this competition, which has economic, technological, political, ideological dimensions, as well as military, is to actually invest in the drivers of our competitiveness here at home, whether that's science and technology, research and development, 21st century infrastructure, smart immigration, policy that attracts and keeps the best talent from around the world. You can go on, but that's the most important thing that we can and should be doing to keep our economic competitiveness and our technological edge. Mm-hmm. On the military side, it's really about going back to the heyday of deterrence. This is about preventing conflict between two nuclear-armed powers. And we have a lot of work to do to really shore up deterrence, both in terms of the Chinese believing our resolve, but also in terms of adapting our capabilities to a very different challenge than what we've honed our military for in the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. Some of that competition will be played out in other regions, and we have to be attentive to that. I'll give you an example. The Chinese have tried to get a lot of our technology either through outright theft, IP theft, or through investing in American technology companies. Mm-hmm. When they get the hand here, we catch them, or CFIUS denies them, or, they're basically blocked in the US. Where's the first place they go to? Israel. Mm-hmm. To see if they can get the same technology through, a company in Herzliya. So we have a lot of work to do with our allies to make sure that we push back on the Chinese threat, and that we compete together to try to prevent them from creating an authoritarian group of states that are using for these technologies in ways that are very much antithetical, not only to the interests of their own people, but to us.
Yeah. Let's spend the final 10 minutes talking about the home front. Obviously, foreign policy starts at home, and home right now is experiencing some difficult times, right? Some serious challenges on multiple levels. We can have the best ideas on how to stabilize the Middle East or other regions of the world. But if we're struggling inside, it's certainly going to be a challenge with regard to implementation. You wrote just very recently with Kath Hicks in Defense One that we need a new president. I'm going to read it to you. One who seeks to heal our divisions, grow Americans' prosperity, and strengthen our society. When we are stronger together at home, we can advance our security interests abroad. I don't know anybody who would disagree with that, but would you mind expanding just a little bit on that?
Well, first of all, let's kind of chronologically think about this. I mean, the pandemic was an opportunity for US leadership to coordinate, as we have in every prior similar crisis, a more effective international response through the G20 and other and the WHO and other mechanisms. The fact that we were sort of AWOL in that, the fact that we mismanaged the crisis here at home, and that the United States has now become an example of how not to manage this as opposed to other countries, be it, you know, South Korea or New Zealand or Germany, of how to manage this more effectively. That's damaged our reputation just from a sense of competence and leadership. And then you add to that the civil unrest around systemic racism, about racial injustice, police brutality, and inequality. And watching the administration, again, the president, instead of trying to bring us together and to use this as a moment for really making real change, further change in American society, that I think, frankly, when you look at the polling, most Americans want to see that happen. He's instead dividing and polarizing. And what I didn't expect, which was really shocking, is he also manufactured a civil military crisis of his very own making that was entirely unnecessary, but was so clearly, you know, about to step over the line, putting the military in a situation where they would be violating the oath to the Constitution that they take. That you've had people who've long kept silent, you know, Jim Mattis, Admiral Mullen, General Dempsey, you know, just on and on down the list. And even General Milley himself saying, you know, he should have never been in the Lafayette Park and he shouldn't have been in the photo op. I mean, this is we can't afford 4.5 more years of this. I really do worry. I think we're in a crisis that would have been difficult for any president and any administration to deal with. But when it's so all of it is so fundamentally mismanaged, I just think that the level of damage that would be done by 4.5 more years of this is hard to fathom and hard to imagine fully recovering from, both domestically and in terms of our global standing. So that's what motivated. I mean, I'm not a terribly partisan person. I'm much more of a policy wonk, and you know, I'm more about, you know, service than I am about, you know, politicking. But I think the reason Kath is the same way, we felt just compelled to speak up after the events of the last couple of weeks, that we just had to speak up and ask the question, what kind of commander-in-chief do we really need in this country to be secure and safe and move forward?
In the remaining 7 or 8 minutes, it's a challenge, but we could do it. So there are 3 issues that I want to address with you briefly, and then we can wrap it up. I think one of them you've already alluded to, so maybe we'll just start with that. The issue of civilian oversight over the armed forces. I guess I'll start with the basic question. Do you feel that we actually have a crisis as far as civilian oversight over the armed forces, or is this something that, you know, on some level we've always had, but it just seems to have gotten worse over the past few years?
I think it's the most alarming part of the civil military crisis that I see is the risk that we could politicize the military as an institution, and that we could put them in a position where they are being used to impair the rights of Americans that we send them overseas to fight for and protect. So it's more, I'm most concerned that you could take the most trusted institution in America, which is based on an all volunteer force and the ability to get young Americans willing to serve and parents willing to send their sons and daughters to serve, that you could tear down that institution by sticking them in the middle of this incredibly toxic and polarized political environment. And that's really what President Trump was threatening to do. And that's why you got such a strong reaction from professional military folks. I think the second piece is, another way of politicizing is, when we use the military, either active duty or retired, as kind of props, whether it's, making speeches at political conventions or lining them up behind the president in, some way, whether it's, we just saw it at the West Point graduation. That whole exercise was a photo opportunity for the president in his campaign. Again, it just risks politicizing. I actually don't worry about civilian control or oversight of the military, in the sense that every officer I know, including my husband and my son, have been steeped in this notion that in a democracy, the military is apolitical and it supports and defends the Constitution and the civilian chain of command, unless it's an illegal or immoral order. And I think if you had the right leadership in the White House and the Pentagon, that would snap right back into line. It's when it's being abused by the White House and not adequately defended inside the Pentagon that you have the problems that we've seen.
Just a point on that, I think, and I may have miscommunicated, what I was more referring to as far as civilian oversight with regard to our foreign policy towards the Middle East, because you mentioned before the critical element of diplomacy, which is lacking, right?
Oh, you mean more of the balance of how
what you said is perfectly irrelevant and pertinent, obviously, but I meant, OSD policy, capital P. Do you feel like they have been, over the past few years, the driving force with regard to policy making vis-a-vis the Middle East, or has it been more the combatant commands? And I'm not putting the blame on anybody, but just as a default, has there been sufficient, let's call it strategic guidance, coming from the building to the geographic combatant command to enable them to do the things that they need to do? That's what I was more
So
referring
you've had a very weak Office of the Secretary of Defense. And one of the challenges, without getting into too many of the details, is when Secretary Mattis, went to appoint a person to the Undersecretary for Policy position, which is kind of his right hand on all oversight of military plans and operations, engagement with the NSC, engagement with all international counterparts. The White House denied him his first 25 picks. So he waited, he was without an undersecretary, a right hand on these issues for, I don't know, over a year. When that vacuum was created, he turned to where he could get staffing, which was the Joint Staff in the military and the COCOMs. And so you had basically a lot of policy work being done by the military. That imbalance definitely needs to be corrected, but it's also something that is very personality and situation driven. When my experience, my model is Secretary Gates, where I walked in the door, he was very clear on what my job was, what I was empowered to do, what I was going to be held accountable for. And he also made that clear to everybody else and vice versa. So if somebody came into my lane and said, hey, I want to go to the Deputies Committee, sorry, your job is this, Michelle's job is that, let her do her job. And to the point of, COCOM plans, if my policy person and my general counsel have not reviewed the plans, don't bring them to me. I will, they are my staff. So there's so much of this that can be corrected with simply good leadership and a strong team on the civilian side, but you haven't had that. And so the imbalance has set in. One thing that gives me hope is I saw civil military relationships go from a nadir under Les Aspin and Colin Powell to a high point under Bill Perry and General Shalley, literally in a matter of a couple of months, based on that fundamentally different approach by those two leaders.
Yeah, and thank you for clarifying that. I don't want to abuse your generosity, Michelle, so I'm going to ask you one final question, if you don't mind sticking with us for only 2 more minutes. Another very important issue at home that certainly could have an impact on our conduct overseas in our foreign policy towards the Middle East specifically is the undeniable underrepresentation of females in high positions of government and in leadership. You obviously are an exception, you're not the norm. And so tell us in your own words, how big of an issue is this and how could it be reasonably rectified knowing that it's not going to happen overnight?
Yeah. So in my view, in a democracy, you want your national security cadre to look like America. And that's not just as a value statement or a moral statement or an equality or fairness statement. It's actually has to do with performance. When you bring women fully in, if they're 50% of the population, do the math, you've just doubled your talent pool from which you can choose. All of the business literature says when you have more diverse boards and leadership teams, companies make better decisions. They actually perform better in a way that translates into the bottom line. I have seen, obviously the government is different than the private sector, but I have seen that happen in diverse decision-making groups in government. You get different perspectives, you get better dissent, you offer a decision maker a more fulsome consideration of the issues from different points of view, you tend to get better decisions out of that. So in terms of getting it done, I think, it takes very consistent work to, number one, insist on diverse slates when you're picking people for jobs. Vice President Biden has made a commitment that his team will be 50-50 in terms of gender. I, as undersecretary, insisted on having diverse slates, not only in terms of gender, but in terms of ethnicity and background when I was filling key jobs. I think investing in mentoring young people and recruiting people from more diverse backgrounds into the field. So it's going to get better with each generation. When I came into this field, I never saw a woman in the room. So many meetings in the Pentagon, that was still true, but many meetings it wasn't true. And so I started to see a few counterparts. Behind me, if I look behind me, oh my goodness, the next generation, and even greater, the next generation after that, huge numbers of women wanting to come work in the Pentagon and in national security. So it's going to change over time, but it takes consistent effort to really invest in that human capital and in the sort of talent pipeline that's going to eventually get you there.
Well, Michelle, there's nothing else for me to say, but thank you. And we are so incredibly honored to have had the chance to speak to you. Hopefully it won't be the last time. You are most welcome whenever you want, but I'll leave the final word to you if you have any concluding thoughts.
Well, just thanks for a great conversation. I hope everybody stays well. I'm looking forward to the point when you can reopen your beautiful offices and we can all meet for a champagne toast in your art gallery. So
you're most welcome, Michelle.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Take care.